Hi, guys, and thank, thank you for joining us on our webinar. My name is Anna, and I am with All About Trucks. Today, our keynote speaker is Director of Training at CTSE and Managing Partner Training Services, Jeff Clark. With over 33 years of experience in the transportation industry, he is here today to talk about the new English proficiency law and to answer your questions. So now let me pass it over to Jeff, and he'll take over. Thank you
Oh, well,
so
thank
much.
you. And thanks All About Truck for inviting us to talk about this issue. We'll kind of go into the history of it and why we got where we're at today. So basically, what's happened is been a lot of changes to the federal regulation. And the federal regulation is 391.11 parentheses B2. And this is the regulation that requires, I'm quoting, that every driver can read and speak the English language sufficiently to converse with general public, understand highway traffic signs and signals in the English language, to respond to official inquiries, and to make entries on reports and records. So that is literally right out of the regulations. If you're a motor carrier, you don't have a copy of this big green book, you need to get one, and every regulation is in there, including this one. So the background on this regulation, the original requirement for drivers to communicate in English was published by the Motor Carrier Safety Regulations in 1936. And the language said ability to read and speak the English language, ability to understand traffic and warning signs. And from 1936 until 1969, that was the standard. In 1969, the language was revised to eliminate the requirement that a driver write in the English language. So from 1936 to 1969, drivers were actually required to write in the English language as well. Now, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration didn't get in business until 1999. Before that, it was the Office of Motor Carriers, and before that, it was just regulated by the Department of Transportation. It's important to note that native English-speaking drivers who are unable to recognize signals and read the English language could also be cited as an ELP driver or LEP driver, limited English proficiency. So what this means is they don't just put people from different countries that have a problem with English. They've actually put native-born American drivers out of service because they couldn't demonstrate that they could read or understand signs. In April 26th of 1995, the North American Free Trade Agreement added a resolution on language proficiency of CMV drivers. What this regulation basically did was part of the North American Free Trade Agreement. It allowed French-speaking Canadian drivers to enter the U.S. and not be tested for English proficiency, and Mexican drivers coming in from Mexico not to speak English proficiency. And they had a caveat in there that as long as safety wasn't compromised. And again, this is a pretty vague standard. So in 1970, they changed the rule a little bit, and it was not declared an out-of-service violation. So if you were stopped, you were cited for being a non-English speaking driver, it was a violation, but it wasn't an out-of-service violation. That changed in 2005 when they made it an out-of-service violation. And how the regulations work is if they promulgate a regulation or a change to the rules, it takes 2 years for enforcement. So even though the rule was passed in 2005, they didn't start putting drivers out of service until 2007. Some people have been doing this a while. Remember, we had the ELD mandate, and they published it, but it took 2 years for the out-of-service condition to appear on it. So it takes 2 years from the time it's promulgated until it takes effect, unless there's an emergency meeting of the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance. Then it becomes standard within 60 days. And we'll kind of touch on that in a minute. In 2004, the CVSA revised its out-of-service criteria to include non-English speaking drivers and provide guidance to roadside inspection officials. So they actually told the investigators at the scales or the police officers to pull them over how to determine whether or not they met that standard. And this memo instructed the inspectors to converse in English with drivers at a minimum about their origin and destination, where you're coming from, where you're going, the record of duty status, how many hours you've been on duty, how many hours you've been driving, and vehicle components and systems regulated by the FMCSA. During the driver interview, inspectors are told they must conduct a portion of the roadside inspection in English, specifically the driver interview. Every roadside inspection starts out with a driver interview, whether it's level 1, level 2, level 3. The very first part of every inspection is the driver interview. And that's where the officer will ask the questions: where are you coming from? Where are you going? What are you hauling? Drivers must respond appropriately in English to demonstrate proficiency. Inspectors are instructed to speak slowly, but naturally are not to rush through questions and may paraphrase in English. The sample driver questions included in the enforcement memo. And that gave us at least some guidance that we know what to expect. But of course, this memo is now expired and is no longer enforced. The memo instructed the inspectors to place the driver out of service if the driver fails to communicate in English sufficiently. In 2008, the FMCSA issued a memo stating that Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration staff and enforcement personnel were provided with tools specifically for evaluating drivers' ability to understand U.S. traffic signs. This policy allowed the driver to explain his or her understanding of traffic signs in a language other than English, provided the inspector can understand the explanation. In 2015, the CVSA voted to remove 39111B2, the non-English speaking driver, as an out-of-service criterion because they could not substantiate the safety impacts. This change went into effect April 1st, 2015. So again, the big thing here is the FMCSA themselves in 2015 studied this issue and said being a non-English speaking driver is still a violation, but it didn't impact safety enough to be an out-of-service condition. The 2016 FMCSA memorandum on English language proficiency, ELP. If you see the word ELP anywhere on a violation, that stands for English language proficiency. So the memo, MC ECE 2016-006, and again, you can email All About Trucks at the end of this presentation, and they can send you this information on email. This removed the out-of-service requirement for ELP violations and contained the following language. Again, this took effect in 2016. If the driver can communicate sufficiently to complete the inspection or investigation, he or she should not be cited for violations of 39111B2, non-English speaking driver. If the driver cannot read, write, or speak English, but can communicate sufficiently with the inspector and investigator, he or she should not be cited for a violation of 39311B2. So that's important. If the driver in the 2016 memo could communicate with the inspector, it would not be a violation. Well, then they went on further in the 2016 memo to tell us what we can do. Tools to facilitate compliance, such as interpreters, I-speak cards, cue cards, smartphone applications, and on-call telephone and interpretation services may be used when interacting with drivers. Use of these devices does not constitute a violation of 39111B2. So what this meant, you could use any of these tools to meet the English speaking requirement. So in other words, you could call your dispatcher or somebody at your company, and they could speak with the officer and interpret for them. And we saw this a lot. They could also use smart apps to communicate with the inspector, and that met the standard because we're communicating. We're just using these devices to do it. So again, that gave us a little bit of leeway on how to address these issues. In other words, if our driver was stopped on the roadside, we can interpret for them. We can use an app. All of these things we were allowed to do under this 2016 memo. And it said that if they completed any of that using any of these items, tools, that it would be sufficient documentation that we met the standard because we're communicating via these items. It also told us in 2016 what constitutes compliance. So in other words, if we're cited for being a non-English speaking driver, what would the FMCSA want or the DOT want as proof that we did this? And what they said is we could take a certificate from the company that they had trained the driver on English speaking. That was the remediation. So if you were if you were doing a compliance review and they were bringing up the violations of non-English speaking driver, as long as you put them through your own training or any type of training, the FMCSA would accept that as you correcting the violation. In 2024, an FMCSA report linked 15% of trucking accidents to language barriers. So what they're saying in 15% of all heavy duty truck accidents were somehow related to language barriers. On September 29th, 2024, the American Truckers United, this is a web group that is very anti English speaking group. They petitioned the United States House Committee and asked for the immediate removal of MCECM 2016, the 2016 memo that allowed it to be not out of service and gave us these tools. So in 2024, this group petitioned the government to do this. On March 2nd, 2025, the president of the Small Business in Transportation, James Lamb, sent an email to the FMCSA requesting the out-of-service criteria be reinstated. So this means the Small Business and Transportation entity again asked the government to make it an out-of-service violation again. On March 26, 2025, the Owner-Operators Independent Drivers Association testified in front of Congress requesting enforcement of the English-speaking language requirement. On April 10th, American Trucking Association President Chris Spear sent a letter to Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy asking for an immediate review of federal directives regarding the enforcement of the English language proficiency standard. On April 10th, Wyoming Representative Harriet Hagman urged the DOT to rescind the 2016 memo. In April, United States Senator John Barrasso called for the English-speaking language proficiency as a safety necessity. So what happened was, basically since March of this year, all of these groups put pressure on Congress and the White House to rescind this 2016 memo that allowed us to not to be an out-of-service violation, and also gave us these tools for compliance, such as interpreters, apps, and everything else. So what happened on April 28th, 2025? Everything changed. On April 28th of 2025, President Donald J. Trump signed an executive order rescinding MCECM 2016. So everything that was in that 2016 memo that we could rely on, that told us what's out of service, what tools we can use, everything else was rescinded. And also, they didn't just stop there. They said, okay, we're now demanding that the CVSA reinstate the out-of-service criteria. So the CVSA has to do that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if they change the criteria or the regulation, it takes effect in 2 years, unless there's an emergency order. So the first time in all the years I've been doing this, the CVSA had an emergency meeting and enacted this out-of-service criteria. And because it has to take 60 days from the day they enact this until it takes effect, basically we're looking at June 25th. So starting on June 25th, if you're stopped in any state and you're not an English-speaking driver, you will be placed out of service. So that's kind of the history of where we're at now. There is a great report out that kind of really demonstrates this is kind of an unfair standard. In February of 2012, the FMCSA published a preliminary review of English proficiency and safe commercial vehicle operation. The study was pretty extensive. It ran 5 years, and the report goes some 113 pages. And I have the report number that'll be included. If you want to email us, we'll give you that report number. And it's good reading. It tells us kind of how we got where we got. The report was designed to gauge the impact of non-English speaking drivers on the safe operation of commercial vehicles. Limited English proficiency, or LEP, you're going to get used to that a lot because you're going to be hearing a lot about that. The violations were examined for a 5-year period from 2002 to 2007, and they looked at about 40,000 inspections that reported an English-speaking language violation. The key takeaways, 37% of all carriers received more than one LEP violation. So what this meant was 37% of all the carriers that were decided for this had more than one. 61% of carriers reported 5 or fewer power units. That's a big number, right? So over half of the drivers put out of service for being non-English speaking were for small companies, less than 5 power units. Do we think that they're going to enforce it more on smaller companies, not the larger carriers? I think so. Yeah, that's my opinion. One of the biggest problems that we're going to have is inconsistencies with enforcement. Because this standard is vague, and right now there's no written test that we can point to. The violations reported by states varied widely. That is, some states enforced the regulation at higher percentages than other states. California had the lowest enforcement rate of non-English speaking drivers. Arkansas and Oklahoma had the highest. Now, California has way more drivers and way more lane miles, more roads, but they were cited a lot less than these other two states. So what that tells us is some of the states are going to be more proactive on enforcing this regulation than other states. Currently, there's no nationwide standard test for English proficiency. Therefore, the regulation cannot be applied in a uniform manner by either motor carriers or enforcement personnel. Right now, we don't know what that standard is. It's going to be whatever the officer decides based on a few of these things that we looked at in the past. There may be clear guidance coming in the following weeks from the FMCSA to address this issue. They said they're going to offer guidance, but the problem is if they offer a written test of any kind, whether it's a written reading test or you have to read the card or whatever, that's going to be something the states are going to have to enforce, not the federal government. So in other words, they can't come up with one test and say, okay, now all the states use this. So the states will have to adopt whatever test that is. Drivers will evaluate on roadside inspections with a driver component and a vehicle component. So in other words, they looked at both. So the current procedures for evaluating whether a driver could comply with directions in English language. This is what we have currently until this June 25th standard, and we have no idea what it's going to be then. But right now, in the driver component, the inspector will ask the driver, confirm if the vehicle is carrying hazardous materials. The driver needs to confirm this in English and also identify the hazardous materials. 2, communicate with the inspector to understand why the vehicle is undergoing inspection. So in other words, if the inspector asks the driver, do you know why I'm inspecting the vehicle or do you know what I'm doing? The driver has to respond that he knows what he's doing and what's going to happen. You're doing an inspection. Confirm if the vehicle has been inspected in the recent past. In other words, they would ask the driver, has this vehicle been inspected before? Were you driving it? And the driver would have to respond. If he doesn't know, he doesn't know, but he doesn't have to answer that question. They have to be able to, when asked for supporting documents, fuel receipts, medical cards, bills of lading, insurance, registration papers, and fuel receipts, they have to understand what he's asking in English. If the inspector requests that he download the ECM or the previous 8 days logs, he doesn't have to give him instructions how to do that. That's all he has to say is, I need you, here's the number, here's the web services number, here's my badge number. I need you to upload this. At that point, he doesn't have to explain anything else. He just has to say that in English. If they can't respond to that, they're going to be cited twice. Once for not knowing how to upload the hours of service, and 2 for not being a non-English speaking driver. So we can see this coming a long way down the road. They're going to cite them for 2 if they can't respond to how to upload the logs. For the vehicle component, the inspector's instructions to pull over and park. In other words, if the officer at scale gets on the speaker and tells you to pull over and park, you have to understand what he's asking. If he tells you to open your door or open the cargo door, again, the driver needs to comply with that without any further explanation. They'll be asked to show the fire extinguisher and other safety devices, and the officer will just say, show me your safety devices, and the driver is going to need to identify the fire extinguisher fully charged, his seatbelt, and also there's triangles. So he's going to need to identify all of those without any more explanation. He'll just say, show me your safety devices. He might ask them to open the hood. This is especially true if you're running a glider or a pre-1999 truck. They want to check the serial number of the engine to make sure you're exempt from the ELD. If he asks you to start the engine, of course, you're going to need to do that. And then he's going to ask to operate the vehicle systems. So he'll say, okay, show me your emergency brake or your tractor protection valve. Turn on the horn, the wipers. He'll check all the lights. And again, he's going to ask all this in English. The driver absolutely has to respond to this in English. Over the years, I've seen a lot where the driver was cited for being a non-English speaking driver because they asked him certain things during the inspection. They could not do what they asked him to do. So if the inspector asked him to turn on the lights, show me your air leakage rates, and anything along that nature, the driver is going to have to be able to do that without further explanation. They'll ask him to rotate the steering wheel to check the steering wheel lash. And one of the reasons now that they're going to make this an out of service again are safety concerns. When undergoing a vehicle inspection, drivers need to communicate effectively with the inspector performing the inspections to protect them and the inspectors. In other words, if the driver is going to climb underneath the truck and tell the driver, release the brake, apply the brake, or he's checking for air leaks, the driver has to absolutely understand what he's doing for his safety and officer safety. English proficiency for CMV drivers is necessary for the driver's ability to read, understand, and respond to roadsides in a timely manner. This is especially true for non-standard signage, such as road condition warnings or customized signs. And what they're referring to on this is, and we've had a couple of big lawsuits on this, which I'll touch on later. If the sign says lane merger and the driver can't read that in English, that's going to be a really big issue. He's going to have to know the signs. If the sign says no trucks, of course, or weight limits or height limits or lane restriction violations, the driver needs to be able to understand these in English. And we can probably train on that just through some tools I'll talk about at the end. But one of the things we're not going to be able to train on is the signboards. Those are those electronic lit signboards, and they have very specific instructions. It may say left lane closed in a mile, traffic congestion ahead, accident ahead, these type of warnings. And those will be in English on that lit sign, and they have to be able to understand what that sign is telling them. During an emergency or an accident, they have to communicate with emergency response personnel, such as firefighters and paramedics, to provide crucial information. We had one of my clients had an accident not too long ago, and they asked him if there was another driver. The driver didn't speak any English. He had no idea what they were asking. And they actually found the guy in a cornfield, the co-driver, because our driver didn't know to respond to it. Now, if your driver is involved in an accident, they don't have to make any statement. The investigating officer may ask them for a written statement. They may ask for a verbal recorded statement. My advice is your driver doesn't need to make any statement. He doesn't. Legally, he doesn't need to make any statement, and he should do that. Now, he shouldn't refuse to make a statement. What he should say is he's reserving any statement until I can contact my company and they can contact an investigation. Because if we start giving a statement, we can't do it in English and we miss words, that could hurt us in a bunch of different ways in your compliance review or a lawsuit. So again, we're under no obligation to make any statement after an accident. We have to cooperate. Who are you? Where are you coming from? That type of thing. But if they ask you for a written statement or a recorded statement on what happened, we don't want to do that. We absolutely don't want to do that. Potential impacts of motor carrier violations of 393.11b2. Now that it's going to be an out of service, our out of service rate could potentially be elevated if we have a number of these violations, and that can trigger a compliance review, and an unfavorable compliance review can result in an unsatisfactory safety rating or a conditional safety rating. And I think we all know that a conditional safety rating will hurt us with insurance, brokers, pretty much everyone. It can also result in fines. In case of an accident and litigation, it may expose the motor carrier to legal liability. Many law firms now reference non-English speaking drivers on their websites. So this is a A lot of we call them plaintiffs attorneys or attorneys that sue trucking companies. They have websites and they list all the ways that they can help a motorist sue a trucking company. And now this being a non-English speaking driver is on pretty much everybody's website now. So in other words, the accident may not be our fault, but they may try to work this in to somehow assigning fault to the company because he was a non-English speaking driver. How bad can this get? In a 2021 case in Florida, the jury ruled that 2 trucking companies were compliant in a 2017 death of an 18-year-old honor student and awarded the family a total of $1 billion in damages. I don't think it's going to end up there. Right now, it's what the jury awarded. And what they awarded that for was because the drivers couldn't speak English. In this case, the driver reportedly could not read English, so the flashing electronic signs put up miles before the standstill, warning drivers to be prepared to stop, were not understood. So what they did is they told the jury that had this guy been able to read this sign, he would have known traffic was going to stop, he would have slowed down. Now, that may or may not be true, but they used that to go after the trucking company. Now, to be honest, the trucking company doesn't have $1 billion, but that was the award. So it's one of the bad things that can happen if our drivers don't speak English. It can hurt us in a compliance review, and it can definitely hurt us in litigation. It can also affect us business-wise. The inability to communicate with customers, loading or unloading personnel, or understanding the specific requirements for cargo being hauled. Examples are temperature, cargo securement, and delivery instructions can impact a company's access to freight. Everybody's probably seen this or gotten a call from a broker saying your driver doesn't have the right temperature, or he went to the wrong place, or he's there at the wrong time. So they have to be able to understand these instructions in English and communicate with the consignee, the people shipping, or the receiver. Additionally, drivers could avoid violations and fine by understanding your directions to resecure a load, relocate tandems, distribute weight, or effect simple repairs. So sometimes if the driver goes into a scale and he has an axle weight issue, the inspector may tell him, okay, I'll give you one chance to slide your tandems and readjust the weight. Well, if the driver doesn't understand what he's asking, this is going to be a violation. And again, if we ask you, okay, your load's not secure, I need you to tighten the strap or tighten the chain, and he doesn't understand what he's asking, that's going to be a violation that could have been avoided by the driver complying with those instructions. So that's kind of how it's going to affect your business that way. One of the big things we're going to see now is state enforcement. This is not going to be uniform by any stretch of the imagination. Some states are going to put guys out of service at a much higher rate than other states. And some states aren't just waiting for the federal government to do this, they're enacting their own legislation statewise. Alaska enacted Act 604 on April 14th, requiring English proficiency among truck drivers, and enforcement will begin on July 13th, 2025. Drivers who cannot display English proficiencies will be fined $500 for the first offense and $1,000 for all subsequent offenses. So that means in Arkansas, if you're cited for being a non-English speaking driver, they're going to fine the driver $500. And now if they do a carrier investigation, the fines can range as high as $10,000, depending on what they find, the carrier. Oklahoma is in the process of attempting to pass Senate Bill 20, requiring that if a commercial vehicle operator fails to meet the English language requirement, law enforcement must impound the vehicle and tow the vehicle. So if this bill passes in Oklahoma, the one in Arkansas passed already, it's been signed into law. Oklahoma is in the process of passing this bill. What this means, if your driver stopped in Oklahoma and doesn't demonstrate English proficiency, that the truck will be towed. Your driver will be put out of service. They won't let it sit there until another driver gets there. They'll tow it to an impound yard. If anybody's ever paid for a tow in Oklahoma, you know how expensive this can be. Not to mention that you're going to have storage charges until you get somebody out there to retrieve the truck. And also, if you have a load on there, the brokers are going to be calling, wondering where your load's at and why it's not there. This bill would also prohibit individuals holding B1 or B2 non-immigrant visas from operating vehicles within the state. What this means, if you're a non-domiciled CDL driver, you are going to have, if this bill passes, you're going to have a lot of issues in Oklahoma. And they're not the only state looking at this. At this time, we don't know what the final bill will look like when it's signed into law, but right now that's what they're looking at. At least 6 other states are looking at similar bills right now for heavy fines, for towing, for fining trucking companies. So again, this rescinding the out of service criteria is just the tip of the spear. We're going to see a lot more of the states following in line with this. So what can we do as a trucking company? Well, there are things we can do. There are things we absolutely can't do. Each state publishes a rules of the road guide. So every state has to have this. Illinois' rules of the road. Every state has this. And what every state's rules of the road have in it is the signs. They have a whole section on signs, what they mean. And again, it's not going to help with directional signs, but it can help with virtually all the other signs. So again, every state publishes this. So it's a good thing to get if your drivers are not lacking in sign skills, to get your state copy of the rules of the road. And again, there's a whole section on signage that can assist them with understanding what these signs convey. There are a lot of apps that can teach English language skills. A couple of highly rated apps are, I've checked probably 50 of them, and they're not all equal. Modely, and we'll have this information on the if you email us. They do 41 languages, $11.99 per month or $59.99 per year per driver. And I think within a month for most guys, or maybe 2 months, they can bring up to the standard they're going to need. Pilser costs $14.95 a month. Again, it's pretty highly rated, but there are others. And what's nice about these is they're delivered on an app. So your driver can, when he's off duty, of course, not while he's driving, he can access these apps and train himself on these English-speaking language skills that they're going to need. Motor carriers should consider adding English language evaluation during the hiring process and document the evaluation. The evaluation should include the ability to understand traffic signs, including but not limited to lane mergers, construction warnings, size and weight restrictions, restricted truck routes, lane restriction, high occupancy vehicle restrictions, and warnings posted on electric sideboards. The first part of any litigation, if you're in an accident being sued, is they're going to go through something called discovery. And that's where the motor carrier is going to have to provide all the materials related to the driver. And the more documentation that you had when you onboarded the driver and trained them, the better it's going to go for the company in the litigation. The ability to understand and identify vehicle systems. So sometimes the motor carrier during the onboarding will take the driver out and ask them to do a pre-trip. Not everybody does this, but if you have a question on the ability to communicate in English, there should be somebody in your company, or you could hire somebody to come out and do the pre-trip with the driver and have him explain in English what he's doing. That's a way that you can document that you're trying to meet this standard. The ability to communicate on origin and destination of the load, if loaded or empty. The ability to understand and transfer hours of service records without instruction. And we do a lot of safety meetings for carriers, and it's not unusual to find a company with 50 or 100 drivers, and a portion of them have no idea how to upload their ELD. We just ran into that very recently. So again, your drivers have to know in English if they're asked to upload the ELD and how to do that. And again, you can do this when you're onboarding or hiring a driver, or have a driver safety meeting, or communicate it through, if you have a group chat site, you can communicate with their phones. The ability to communicate information on a bill of lading to include weight and pounds. This is important because if the safety investigator asks, how much weight do you have on here? Well, they have to be able to read the bill of lading and say how much that is in pounds, right? Or if he's explaining, okay, you have 36,000 pounds on axle 1, he needs to know what they're saying, right? Because maybe he's giving us a chance to move the tandems to get that weight down to 34,000 or less. So, conclusion, we're waiting for the guidance from the FMCSA regarding enforcement. it will be anticipated this will be subjective at best. And in other words, we know the few things we talked about earlier they're going to ask on a roadside inspection. I think we can be pretty confident that they're going to ask at least parts of that. Our problem is it will be subjective, and the enforcement personnel will have wide discretion on this. In other words, we may get stopped in California, and the inspector is perfectly fine with our English ability, but then we're stopped in Arkansas, who will now make it their mission to put everybody they can out of service to make money, and they might inspect the same driver a day later and say, no, you don't meet this. So this is what we're going to be looking at. Enforcement will not be uniform at all. Some states will be much more vigorous on this. Arkansas did not pass this bill because they're going to be less vigorous on this. They passed this bill because they're going to start enforcing this as hard as they can come June 25th. The best defense you can make as a motor carrier now is implementing these testing and training of your drivers to get in front of this as much as you possibly can. Now, one of the questions that come up a lot that I've gotten in the last month since all this started working its way out is we don't have enough drivers now. So what happens if we just eliminate all the non-English speaking drivers? We put them all out of service. Well, nobody has an answer to this. Number one, it's going to be difficult at best. And number two, is it going to impact the industry? My firm belief it is. Again, some states will be very proactive on this. And again, as soon as we get an update on what the FMC decides to give us as guidance, we'll convey that on the All About Trucks Facebook as soon as we get guidance from them. I emailed them again on Friday, and they still have no guidance for us at all. So we're relying on the things that we talked about earlier for testing, or what we can reasonably believe they're going to do. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Perfect. Jeff, thank you so much. You have such vast knowledge of anything related to safety and training, and we are very thankful to have you here with us. Now, in terms of questions, this would be a great time for you to start submitting them in the chat while we still have Jeff here to answer them. And if we don't have any additional questions, then please submit them to webinar@allabouttrucks.us, and we'd be happy to answer them from there.
And if they have any compliance questions at all, I'd be happy to answer them.
For now, absolutely. Okay, so we have a question coming in. How could we help drivers who are already hired?
By training them, bringing them in, suggesting they use one of the apps that we talked about. Again, we'll have that information available to anybody who emails us. But those apps are a good place to start because you don't need to bring the driver in for it. Most companies, the drivers are not all maybe in the same area as the motor carrier. So we can communicate with these apps. And I think some of the apps also have testing that they can relay back to the motor carrier. That's probably the most efficient way to do it for drivers you've already hired.
Perfect. And then the same person is asking if you can recommend app names that they can use to check.
I'm sorry?
Names of apps?
Yeah, I have them on this. Again, if you email All About Trucks, we'll be happy to send you a concise thing of what we did today. And that will list a few of the apps that I researched. I researched about 25, and these two came up with probably the best as far as cost and efficiency.
Right, so I see it here. We have mondly.com. And then there's another one as well here. We'll send that out in the blast email after the webinar is over.
And there's certainly more. Some were limited in the amount of languages they spoke, and some were exorbitant price-wise. But these were the best priced and, by all accounts, efficient.
Perfect. And then our next question is, will DOT be checking the driver statuses as well?
The driver statuses? Yes, absolutely. Arkansas put this in their bill. Wyoming is putting it in their bill. They're going to check the driver's residency standards. In other words, are they domiciled CDL? Do they have the correct visa? Do they have the right to work in the U.S.? That's absolutely going to be checked.
We also have Felix here asking, are there any programs at the moment that can help drivers with proficiency?
The apps I talked about is probably the best thing. Again, language is difficult for me. I tried to speak other languages several times. I have no ability for it. My brother can hear something and pick it up right away. So everybody's going to be a little bit different. But these apps that we recommend, well, not recommended, these apps we identified, and again, there's other ones too. Uh, because it's a monthly fee, some of them will pick it up much faster than others.
Okay, perfect. And moving on, we do have a specific question. Let's say I have a driver that gets pulled over in Minnesota and he doesn't pass the ELP. He gets put out of service for 10 hours and then can he leave or does he need to send a different driver?
Well, no, good question. If you're put out of service for hours of service violation, it will be 10 hours or 32 hours, depending on the violation. And then you're good to go. If you're put out of service because you have a vehicle issue, like a tire's flat, as soon as the tire is fixed, you're good to go. If you're put out of service for being a non-English speaking driver, this is the problem. And this is what we touched on earlier. That one of the things the FMC said previously is that you could get a certificate from the company that you train them, and then they could be put back in service. But nobody can tell us how that's going to be enforced, right? So it's not like after 10 hours later, you could go back and make a good argument that now all of a sudden he meets that standard. Or you might be able to, right? But you have to document some type of training you did or some type of testing you did. And Minnesota is a great example because they will do things that other states won't. They used to put drivers out of service for having a can of Red Bull in the truck. So again, Minnesota, I think, will take this to the extreme. But no, if you're put out of service for being an English-speaking driver, you're going to have to demonstrate that now the driver's in compliance. And again, a certificate that they took an English language test or that they took some type of training will do it. This is why Oklahoma is going to tow the truck away. So you're not going to be able to send the driver right back to pick up the truck. It's going to be in a police impound yard. So if the same driver shows up, guess what they're going to do? Give him the test again. And they're not going to let him take the truck because he still doesn't speak English enough.
Oh, that this is going to impact so many lives starting on June 25th.
Absolutely. And again, when they changed the rule in 2016 and allowed it to be still a violation, but not an out of service violation, it didn't. And the reason they did that was they said it didn't impact safety significantly. And there's some of these I don't even know how to describe it, these groups that are pushing these regulations to make it an out of service. I don't know what their best intent is. I don't think it's safety. They'll point to one or two accidents where the driver didn't read the sign correctly or this or that. But there are plenty of English-speaking drivers that have the same exact accident. So, again, it's very subjective.
That puts us to our next question. Are they going to give any certificates if you pass the test?
Who's they? If you take a test on one of the apps, and there are some that have tests, some don't. But I think that you documented that the driver took this training, and then that you interviewed him afterwards. You as the motor carrier, if you don't get a certificate, and document that he took this training, and we interviewed him, and he met the standards based on what we have. In other words, he responded to official inquiries. He can identify the components on the truck.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jeff. And our last question that I have here is, what about non-domiciled CDL drivers? We should only work with drivers who can provide documents listed in the I-9?
This is going to be a lot of states are pushing this now for non-domiciled CDL drivers. There are some regulations. We're going to have to wait for the courts to kind of work it out. If I'm from Illinois and I'm traveling through Oklahoma, can they put me out of service for being a non-domiciled CDL driver? I don't think so. But if I'm based in Oklahoma, yeah, absolutely. Now, that's not English-speaking proficiency. That's non-domiciled license. Mm-hmm. So that's a separate issue. Okay. And again, I'd be happy to answer questions on anything to do with regulations. I don't know. I won't make it up.
We appreciate your help. Thank you so much. And actually, we do have one more question coming in. What if my driver has a good reading, speaking, but writing is not as great? What will happen then?
I think he'll be fine. Right now, there's no writing requirement. there was in the original regulation in 1936, but they took it out. They never put it back in. Can he respond to inquiries? In other words, that's verbal. Can he make the required entry level requirements? In other words, can he fill out the logbook, right, and enter the logbook? Does he have to write down a statement? No, he doesn't, right? So again, I don't know how they're going to do a writing test. We'll see, but I don't envision this happening.
And we actually have one more coming in here, Jeff. So there will be a ticket for the driver for the ELP, because if there's no ticket, then there's nothing to fight in court.
Correct. If they just put them out of service on a roadside inspection, there's no ticket. There's virtually no way to data queue it.
Okay. Perfect. And one more coming in. What about no CDL straight truck drivers or Sprinter van drivers?
Yeah, there's a lot of issues there. They're under CDL. So a couple of things with that. They can have a vehicle that's under 26,001 gross vehicle weight rating. But when they stop on the scale, especially we see this with auto haulers, and when they stop on the scale, the actual physical weight of the vehicle is over 26,001, then they'll be cited for not having a CDL. Also, starting allegedly June 25th, you'll no longer have to carry a copy of your medical examiner certificate if you have a CDL. Now, drivers that are over 10,001 pounds and under 26,001 pounds will still have to carry their medical examiner certificate with them.
Okay.
Everything for a commercial motor vehicle kicks in at 10,001 except for CDL. That kicks in at 26,001, which means we don't need to do any drug testing unless they have a CDL. But everything else kicks in: hours of service, insurance requirements, absolutely everything except for having a CDL if it's under 26,001 and no drug testing. But everything else is all applicable.
Thank you. Thank you. They have also provided one more question, Jeff. If you mentioned that you are not able to send out the logs and you get 2 violations for no English and not being able to, would you get 2 violations for no English and not being able to send the logs?
My opinion is yes. It's like now if you're stopped and you have a brake violation and the brake's out of adjustment, they'll issue you once, say the left front brake is out of adjustment. They'll issue a violation for it being out of adjustment. They'll also give you another violation for the same brake because the automatic slack adjuster doesn't work. In other words, first it's out it's a violation because it's out of adjustment, and second is the automatic slack adjuster isn't working because it's out of adjustment. So it's 2 for the same violation. My opinion is we're going to see the same thing with this. They're going to ask the driver to upload the logs. He's not going to be able to do it. And they can make the argument that, well, number one, he has to know how to do it. That's the regulation. And 2, they can say that he didn't know how to do it because he didn't speak English well enough. So, yeah, I think we're going to see double violations on this, just like the brake violations.
Well, this is truly something that is going to change the game for so many people.
Yeah, and again, that's why, and I appreciate All About Trucks doing this today. We got so many calls on this that we thought it was necessary that, or at least be helpful for everybody to understand how we got where we're at and what it's going to look like going forward.
Well, definitely moving forward. I mean, it would be incredible to hear feedback from everybody that tuned in. If you like the webinar and you would like to see more content like this, we'd love to hear your feedback, and we appreciate everybody for tuning in. And Jeff, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We appreciate it. Thank you so much, guys. Please make sure to email webinar@allaboutTrucks.us if you have any additional questions.